Hey guys, welcome to Teaching Modern Architecture. Today we're going to speak about the Villa Savoye by Le Corbusier, specifically the Architectural Promenade, which may be the greatest architectural achievement of the last 100, 200 years. We're going to speak about two aspects of the Architectural Promenade. Number one, the experience of circulating through it, and number two, the conceptual ideas that can be read in the form. So, when I refer to the Architectural Promenade, I'm referring to the entire experience of the project, starting at the entry gates, moving on a continuous circulation path all the way to the building, then circulating through the three levels of the project, starting at the ground level, moving on the circulation ramp to the garden terrace, and then continuing on the ramp all the way to the solarium roof. So the conceptual idea that has become quite accepted amongst historians for the project is this idea that the architecture is a temple to the modernist movement, with references to classical architecture. In his 1923 manifesto to modernism, Towards an Architecture, Le Corbusier makes repeated references to the Parthenon as being this kind of perfect object. And the way Le Corbusier framed it was the Parthenon was the result of years and years of experimentation of the parts involved in this building type. And the Parthenon was this perfect result of this standardization process. But when Le Corbusier reflected upon his own epoch, the modern age, he felt that the field of architecture had failed to create the perfect object that captured the act of living. And so the Villa Savoye was part of this process, trying to standardize the perfect housing response to the stated problem of living. Starting at the entry gates, we begin to see our first glimpses of the project, starting with this tiny little gardener shed that he puts at the very front. And then one by one, we start to see the facades of the project as we make our way up to the building entry. Now, what's really strange and quite odd is that if the visitor is traveling by car, i.e. as intended by the architectural experience, they never actually see the front facade of the building. Now, I would call this the front facade because it's the most formally aggressive in the project. But Le Corbusier referred to it as a kind of object without a front, a kind of four-sided object that didn't privilege one side over the other. Now, in another video, I'll argue why I think it does have a front facade, but for now, let's just leave it at that. One notable thing about the entry experience is that Le Corbusier considers the precise turning radius of a vehicle in the design of the Architectural Promenade. For example, the curvature of the massing along the ground level is according to that precise turning radius. But we can read this inclusion as being more than the achievement of a simple programmatic requirement, and instead it's actually a pretty loaded conceptual statement. Returning to his manifesto, Le Corbusier includes 3 chapters on airplanes, ocean liners, and automobiles. But it wasn't just mere admiration of technology for technology's sake. Le Corbusier viewed these objects and valued these objects because he felt they had an economy, an efficiency, a streamlining in both their parts and performance. And he wanted to bring the same spirit to modern architecture. Because when he reflected on the architecture of his own time, what he saw was useless functions, useless decorations, spaces that were not necessary for the achievement of the architecture. When we hear the words standardization and industrialization, we immediately associate it with the coldness of function. But this was not the priority for Le Corbusier. I think it's far more appropriate to associate it with something like the Japanese concept of kaizen. So if you think of a sushi knife, this is an object through centuries, through generations of small, gradual improvements, has become this kind of ideal object perfectly suited to its task. This is the spirit of what Le Corbusier was trying to achieve with housing architecture. It's typical within architecture that the architect will emphasize their building entry. Le Corbusier does something quite different at the Villa Savoye in the sense that he's downplaying the entry. He's making it quite understated with just this single, tiny, piddly step out front. And if we think about why he might do this, we can consider the diagram of the building, which is this white box floating in the air amongst the trees above the ground. So if he was to emphasize the building entry, perhaps with a grandiose staircase, you can see how this would also emphasize the existence of the ground plane. And this is something that Le Corbusier is trying to remove from his architectural project. We've spoken about how the architecture is commonly read as a temple to the modernist movement. And we can read this single step as being a reference to the history of architecture and the church typology. The church typology often has a set of stairs upon entry that the visitor ascends to separate them from the filth of the outside ground before entering the holiness of the interior space. So we can read Le Corbusier's single step within this conversation. This is something that Mies does throughout his career as well, with his plinths at Barcelona Pavilion, Farnsworth, the Seagram Building, or Crown Hall. So after passing through the front entry doors, we enter what Le Corbusier calls the vestibule. And you can see that it's fairly basic, toned down, and bare bones in its architectural elements. There's not much more than a ramp, a spiral staircase, some walls, etc. The visitor has three options. Number one, they can continue walking straight towards the circulation ramp. Number two, they can make a left towards the spiral stair. Or three, somewhat improbably, they can walk to the back where the service quarters are found. And we see that this bare bones treatment continues in the functional and programmatic decisions on the ground floor as well. So here we find the garage, we find the storage, we find the chauffeur's apartment, we find the maid's rooms. And what Le Corbusier is doing is he's liberating the physical space for himself to focus on more experiential uses on the terrace level and the solarium level. So the ground level is this kind of functional stash where he dumps as much program as possible to give him flexibility later. What is immediately apparent about this space is that the circulation ramp is placed precisely on axis in the center of the plan. And why this stands out is that generally, modern architecture did not centralize things in this way. Modern architecture was generally more interested in themes like asymmetry. And we can read the form as being a statement about the power and possibility and potential of modernism. So by embracing the spirit of the modern age, by embracing these new technologies that have an efficiency, an economy, and streamlined performance, by just ridding ourselves of this historical baggage from these useless, obsolete objects that do not capture the spirit of our time, we can aspire to something more. We can aspire to a higher level. And we can attempt and perhaps even achieve the Parthenon of the modern age, this perfect object which captures precisely and perfectly the act of modern life. One of my professors at SciArc, Russell Thompson, described the Villa Savoye as being a building that is designed to be experienced in motion. And we get our first taste of this when we're walking up the circulation ramp, because the ramp is designed to be immediately adjacent to the garden terrace above. And how Le Corbusier separates the terrace from the interior is with glass transparencies. And upon these windows, he places these horizontal stiles that filter the light coming down onto the ramp and upon you as you ascend it. So it's not too much of an exaggeration to read into this that it's this kind of metaphorical ascendance, transcendence, this holy rising to another level, because that's how it feels as you walk upon the ramp. So upon reaching the top of the circulation ramp, the visitor is given three options. They can walk to the right towards the spiral staircase and various other programmatic components. They can pass through a clear glass door and enter the salon living space. Or they can go to their left through a solid door that leads outside to the garden terrace. Upon entering the garden terrace, the visitor has officially left the interior of the project. And one of the purposes of the garden terrace is essentially to act as a giant light well that brings light into the project and floods the salon living space with this beautiful natural lighting, because it's immediately adjacent to the garden terrace. That southwestern facade, the immediate edge of the garden terrace, receives the most amount of sunlight for the building. So, when someone's leaving the garden terrace, getting back on that circulation ramp and going towards the solarium level, they're probably basking in sunlight. So you can see it's hard to avoid these metaphorical ideas of transcendence or ascending to another level. You're metaphorically going to another level, you're spatially going to another level. So you make that final turn and start moving towards the roof. And as you do, this window in the distance comes into your view and starts drawing you forward. And as you get closer to it and arrive at it, you see that it's got this perfectly framed view of the distant horizon. And now this ascension of modern man is finally complete. And this is the climactic moment of the project. Alright guys, hope you enjoyed the video today. If you did, please feel free to subscribe to the channel or give me a like. I also do architectural tutoring and writing help, so if you're interested in something like that, just give me a shout and let me know. See you soon.